Good morning and welcome to the Adult Forum at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Minneapolis. My name is Guillermo Hansen. I'm a professor of theology and global Christianity at Luther Seminary in St. Paul. Before coming to the United States, I was a professor in my country, in the Ecumenical Institute in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So my first language is Spanish. And I was also a member of the Council of the Lutheran World Federation for many years, and also a theological consultant in the Department of Theology and Studies of the Lutheran World Federation, which is the global expression of the communion of Lutheran churches. So it is a privilege to be with you this morning, and we're going to have a PowerPoint presentation, and I will disappear in a little bit, but not my voice. That will be present as we go through the ideas, the topics that I would like to reflect with you, that has to do with our faith, has to do with ethics, and it has to do with some of our pressing existential concerns nowadays. So without further ado, let me go now to my presentation. You will have the slides and then my voice, and at the end I will come back in person to you. I was invited almost 6 months ago to talk at Westminster Presbyterian, and the topic was about how to be or how to foster community in the face of the political and ideological hostility that we were living and still live in our country, this polarization and division that we experience, particularly in our cultural, social, and political scenario. So my talk was supposed to address the relationship of faith and politics, which is one of the areas in which I am particularly interested in, and also focusing on this phenomena of populism that we are experiencing and how different religious traditions relate to this new political scenario. But of course, now we have another theme looming, another elephant in the room, we could say, which is another form of hostility, polarization, caused in this case by a biological phenomenon, a natural phenomenon, what we call the coronavirus pandemic, which is spreading all over the globe. So the question or the theme that I present to you this morning is how we can relate this first topic that I was supposed to address, our division and hostilities in our society, with this new reality that suddenly occupy our lives and our attention and our concerns. A few days ago, I was watching a video of one of my favorite thinkers, the Slovene philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who in a Zoom conversation was reflecting about the present pandemic. And in this conversation, what stood out for me was his emphasis that in the present situation of this lockdown and shelter at home, shelter in place, We need now more than ever, he said, to reflect on the meaning of being spiritual beings faced by this collective threat that will hit very hard those who are especially most vulnerable. Not only the previously sick and the elderly, not only those who are at the forefront of the healthcare system doing an incredible work in the hospitals, but also those who do not have the privilege to shelter in place due to their desperate needs to keep working due to their low incomes, and also those who do not have access to adequate medical care, or those who cannot flee anywhere due to their precarious housing conditions, which is not only present here in the United States, but globally. So what does it mean to be spiritual in this crisis, this major disruption that we are living? It has to do a lot with, of course, being community. And community, as you know, is related in its root, the word, with the notion, very religious notion of communion. After all, we're talking about this common unity, what unite us. And if we speak about the spiritual reality of communion, we are also speaking about the mediation for this common union, which has to do with what is called the commons, what belongs to all of us as creatures, as living beings. In politics, we have also called that the Commonwealth, as it was the case of some of the US colonies, or I should say British colonies in the US, becoming the states in New England, but also has to do with the reality of communism, communism, community, common unity, communion. But of course, I'm not speaking about communism in the totalitarian sense that we are used to think about, but in the sense of this concern with the commons. And of course, spirituality, community has to do, especially from a Christian point of view, with being neighbors to each other. And this last point is a little bit what I want to explore with you this morning, being neighbors to each other. In this spirit, I also want to invite you to reflect on what it means to be community and neighbor, not just as a church or religious group. This is also, or you should say, always with us, right? As we reflect, what does it mean, for example, to be church, to be this community called church? But I want to go beyond that, to reflect about what it means to be a community and neighbor as a nation, and indeed globally as humanity. If anything, this crisis we're facing together is raising important questions of how our larger civil, economic, political, and social communities are structured, revealing telltale signs of a crisis or a major disruption of daily life. And this crisis and disruption leave exposed injustices and vulnerabilities that we will have to face and address in a courage and faithful way. So what does it mean to confess the God of Israel, the God of Jesus Christ, the God of life, in the face of the major disruption and hostility towards our existence. What are the gestures, the events, the processes that may give us hope and a renewed sense of community? In the end, what is community when we have been exposed to this reality that, as we can see in the news in the last week and the former weeks, this reality where the market forces, where the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman calls Father Greed, cannot defend us, cannot protect us in the midst of this crisis. For obvious and understandable reasons, our first reaction to this crisis can be a little apocalyptic. So we're all familiar, right, with this scenario, the zombies, horror movies. These are, of course, highly symbolic of our initial shock that we experience when something ordinary has been disrupted. And we express that in cinema, right? Through many different genres. And one of these is this type of apocalyptic zombie movies, where after a nuclear holocaust, a war, or a pandemic, we see humanity turning against itself, like a splitting between predators and prey, those who eat flesh and destroy, and those who are consumed. And I wonder if, the reality side that we have experienced, the hoarding, you remember the toilet paper hoarding, suddenly the supermarkets ran out of them, doesn't express this initial shock, desperation of us turning against our neighbors in a way when we try to accumulate to protect ourselves with disregard towards the needs of the others. But moments of crisis can also show that far from us turning into these meat-eating zombies, or more accurately, toilet paper hoarders, the Spirit also blows, turning millions of people not against each other, but for one another. In times of crisis, we can also rediscover our social and spiritual nature, our call to be neighbors to one another. And here I'm showing you some pictures that you, I'm sure, are very familiar with from Italy a couple of weeks ago, as when they were ordered to be in their homes, people started to relate in a different way from their balconies, and music, poetry, was one of these ways of expressing our solidarity with each other, our social nature, our humanity. So there are plenty of other clips that you can see in YouTube, that you can watch, also in the news, and you will see that most of them take place in neighborhoods and among neighbors. And with this note, I would like to read a few verses from the famous parable that Jesus told us about the Good Samaritan, teaching us that creating community is not just being social, or, as we say here, Minnesota nice, particularly to those who are close to us, but it rather means that community is the outcome of becoming a neighbor to others, to the others that are in need, to these others that most of the time are unknown to us, almost anonymous, but there is a distance between us. So let me read this passage where Jesus says in Luke chapter 10, a certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who both stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. By chance, a certain priest was going down that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he traveled, came where he was. And when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. He came to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine. He set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the host, and said to him, "Take care of him. Whatever you spend beyond that, I will repay you when I return." Now, which of these 3 do you think seemed to be a neighbor to him who fell among the robbers? And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." And then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So as we can see in this passage, to be a neighbor is not just to be next to another, but to make this other close to us, to come close to this other person. And we become close to something that in principle was completely distant. We can say even alien, strange, or unknown. It is to tend to those who are in need. This is why being a neighbor, in this sense, is a foundation of community, of finding this what we have in common, by which we become bounded, linked to each other in new and healing ways. In the year 2009, some of you may recall that the swine flu started to spread, threatening to become a major pandemic around the world. In this context, in one of my classes, we studied a letter written by the reformer Martin Luther in the year 1527. And this letter was called "Whether One May Flee a Deadly Plague." This was a time when the bubonic plague was spreading across Germany and many other parts of Europe, creating a scenario very similar to what we are experiencing today. 1527 was a terrible year for Germany or Central Europe, but also was a terrible year for Luther himself, probably one of the worst years in his life. As we know from his reflections, meditations, and letters, he felt as though he was losing his faith. And he was going through tremendous existential, spiritual struggles, and also facing very serious medical conditions. We don't know exactly what was going on with him in terms of health um, problems, but many speculate that he had a very, very severe stroke. Whatever the case may be, he was consulted by a pastor in the city, the Eastern German city of Breslau. Today, this is part of Poland, about what to do when the plague hits town. Should we stay? Should we flee? It is curious that even at that time, or especially at that time, we also kind of find these evangelical type of super Christian heroes that say, no, you have to stay, right? Because we're covered by the blood of Jesus. And this is God's punishment visiting us. So we have to stay put. But as you will see, Luther had a very different view. He had a biblical pastoral approach that is very illuminating also for us today. So let me share some passages from this letter that was circulated throughout Europe and provide a lot of guidelines in his context back in the 16th century for how to face the crisis created by the plague. So one of the questions is who should stay in the town, in the city, when the plague arrived? And the first group of people that Luther mentioned are those belonging to the spiritual office, those who are engaged in a spiritual ministry, such as preachers and pastors, must remain steadfast before the peril of death. However, he also said that those who are not needed should also go away, should flee. Only those who need to remain to tend to those in distress should stay in town. But here comes what I find very interesting in Luther's view: who should also stay in town? And he mentions here all those in public office, such as mayors, judges, and the like, are under the obligation to remain. Why? Because you need to keep your city, your society functioning. That was for Luther an act of not just moral duty, but an act of love. So he says, this too is God's word, which institutes secular authority and commands that town and country be ruled, protected, and preserved. Because life is so precious, and God has instituted this ministry of the secular office of government, of what we call today the state, in order to serve the commonwealth, the commons, which is life. And then he refers to the most vulnerable, in this case, children who are orphaned, for example. He also mentions in another passage, of course, the elderly that were left behind. So in this case, when guardians or close friends are under obligation to stay with them or to arrange diligently for others nursing care for their sick friends. Because remember, the panic led everyone to flee. So he continues, yes, no one should dare leave her neighbor unless there are others who will take care of the sick in their stead and nurse them. However, this doesn't mean at all for Luther that one has to expose oneself to the plague, in this case, the virus for us, because, quote, it is not forbidden, but rather commanded that by the sweat of our brow we should seek our daily food, clothing, and all what we need, and avoid destruction and disaster whenever we can, as long as we do so without detracting from our love and duty towards our neighbor. So here you see a very similar scenario that we are experiencing today, as the scientists, the medical profession, the experts understand very well how disease, how in this case a pandemic spreads, and we are now sheltered in place at home. This is for Luther an obligation as well, even though back in his time they didn't understand very well how diseases are or were transmitted, even what is the nature of the disease as such. And Luther continues, anyone who does not do that for his neighbor, but forsakes him and leaves him to his misfortune, becomes a murderer in the sight of God. So for Luther, the primordial concern was the neighbor, and especially those who were most vulnerable. As I said before, the tendency was to abandon them behind. Also, he makes reference to what today we will call, the public health. And he says it would be well where there's such an efficient government in cities and states to maintain municipal homes and hospitals staffed with people to take care of the sick, so that patients from private homes can be sent there. Now, these are a little bit in the 16th century, the seeds of what today we call a welfare state. And for Luther, this conception of the responsibility of government, of those in charge of the administrations of the affairs of the state, was an office ordained by God, is the way in which God takes care of creation, what we can call politics. And Luther continues, where there are no such institutions, and they exist in only a few places, we must give hospital care and be nurses for one another in any extremity or risk the loss of salvation and the grace of God. In other words, God is concerned not just with our spiritual welfare, but with our health, with our bodily welfare as well. So godliness, and I quote Luther again, is nothing else but service to God. And service to God is indeed service to our neighbor. For it is certainly true that he who despises such great promises and commands of God and leaves his own people destitute violates all of God's law and is guilty of the murder of his neighbor or her neighbor whom he or she abandons. So there you hear that the command to love your neighbor is equal to the greatest command to love God, and that what you do or fail to do for your neighbor means doing the same to God. If you wish to serve Christ and to wait on him, very well, you have your sick neighbor close at hand. Go to her and serve her, and you will surely find Christ in her, not outwardly, but in his word. So whoever wants to serve Christ in person would surely serve his neighbor or her neighbor as well. And towards the end of this very important letter, he addressed those who disdain medicine. As you can see here, there's a parallel with some sectors in our societies, especially among religious people, evangelicals, who had these suspicions of science and medicine. So Luther says, those who disdain medicine, this is not trusting God, but tempting God. Because God has created medicines and provided us with intelligence, with reason, to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health. So for Luther, the neighbor, from a Christian point of view, quoting repeatedly Matthew 25, chapter 25, the neighbor is the place where we find Christ, who comes to us in need for shelter, care, and compassion. We serve Christ by standing by those in need, or even more radically, by becoming a neighbor to those who suffer most and would be condemned to death if the rest of society let go of their hands. Second, to be truly spiritual or godly, as the word that Luther uses, is nothing else than service to God. And service to God is service to the neighbor. Times of crisis and need are times of deep spiritual engagement, which includes addressing how a community pulls together their spiritual, human, and material resources to face together not just the threat of death, but for the sake of life. This is why fleeing or shelter in place, as we call it today, is also an act of love, because we are protecting the health and lives of others, and also of ourselves and those who live with us. And thirdly, Luther is concerned with the welfare of the whole community, regardless of their spiritual or confessional state, we could say. And is concerned with the whole human being, including the mental, the spiritual, and the bodily well-being. In doing so, he addresses the three most important spheres of life, what we can call the spiritual or the church, politics, and family and economics. No, at that time the family was like the small and mid-sized business. No, it was the cornerstone of the economic activity in medieval life until very recently. So family, taking care of the family, was taking care of economics. And it is up to us, our call, to discern where and how we serve God and the neighbor in all of these three spheres. And I always like to see these three aspects of, let's call it the spiritual, church, economics, and politics, as the three dimensions in which our existence takes place. And politics stands like in between the spiritual, where we're fed with our values, with our ideas, our concepts, right? Of what it means to be human, what it means to protect life. So politics stands between that and economics, where we engage in the production and reproduction of life. So Luther's approach to the main pandemic of his time brings together for us this notion that human vocation, our call, is precisely to be a neighbor, to become a neighbor, to draw close to every member of society, particularly those who are physically, mentally, spiritually, economically, materially in the ditch. Becoming a neighbor indeed involves feelings of compassion, but also very concrete physical and material action. Furthermore, it means to engage in our call and vocation as citizens who now face a threat to that which we have in common, the gift of life. So one of the learnings coming from this approach that Luther had is to understand how related is our spiritual life with our political life and our economic life. So the question becomes, what can we do now from our shelter in place? How can we become a neighbor? Of course, besides the concrete acts that we do for others, the small or great gestures that make a difference to the life of others, this is also a time to take stock of our ideas, of what we can say our spiritual dimension, that Zizek. You remember at the beginning I mentioned this philosopher, Slavoj Zizek. He also spoke about rediscovering our spirituality. So this is a time to take stock of our ideas, of our beliefs, our values, our aspirations, our dreams. Because in times of crisis, as we live today, seemingly impossible ideas may become possible. Egalitarian and sensible ideas designed to keep all safe, secure, and healthy are together or live together in times of turmoil with predatory ideas designed to perpetuate social inequality. So I want to finish inviting you to reflect on these different ideas that are part of our larger political, social, and cultural conversation. And we were very active in this conversation, of course, in this presidential race and the nomination, right, especially in the Democratic Party, where a lot of ideas were tossed around pertaining to how to organize our economy, how to empower those who are disadvantaged, how to confront the health crisis, and so on and so forth. So, if something we learned from Luther's letter is that in times of crisis as we live now, there's a lot of ideas going around. But the challenge is which type of ideas or values will serve the world that is to come after the crisis. Is what some thinkers call a time of bifurcation, right? As though history, when it's reaching a crisis, tends to bifurcate. It has like two different trajectories are open after that. So Zizek, the philosopher that I mentioned before, he says this is an ideal time as we are sheltering in place, those of course who can, but those who are sheltering in place, to reflect about what it means to be spiritual. And we gain this insight from Luther. The spiritual involves radically our engagement with the neighbor, because this is where Christ comes to us. And in order to serve this neighbor in need, it's not enough, let's say, the individual personal gestures, even though this is very important in our face-to-face relationships, but also how this engagement with the neighbor is translated in policies, right? The realm of politics. Remember that politics is one of the ways, not the only one, but one of the major ways in which God cares for creation, for human beings.